Aaliyah endured constant bullying from her racist teacher. Yet what the teacher remained unaware of was that Aaliyah's father was the principal. Witness how this struggle for power within the classroom culminates in an unexpected twist you won't anticipate. Additionally, please share where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. The bell echoed through Brierwood High's corridors, its piercing sound bouncing off the shiny floors and stretching down the lengthy hallways. Students rushed to their classrooms, the sound of sneakers shuffling and quiet conversations filling the atmosphere. However, room 306 had a different vibe, electric, almost expectant. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front, her stance unyielding, her face wearing her usual stern demeanor. Her eyes scanned the room, silently assessing her students as they hurried to their seats. The walls behind her were adorned with neatly arranged literary posters featuring famous quotes from Shakespeare, Austen, and Hemingway. The whiteboard shone behind her, immaculate except for the date written in her sharp, angular handwriting. Mrs. Thompson commanded attention with her presence. An unspoken rule existed in her classroom: never challenge her authority. Over the years, she built a reputation as a teacher who tolerated no nonsense. Her lectures were precise, her rules non-negotiable, and her punishments swift. Few students dared to oppose her, and those who did quickly regretted it. The room settled into its usual rhythm as students entered. Books were placed on desks, notebooks opened, pens ready, yet there was a subtle undercurrent of something different today. A faint buzz of curiosity simmering beneath the surface, like a quiet hum on the verge of becoming louder. This subtle change became evident when someone entered the doorway moments later: Aaliyah Williams. Her entrance was quiet and unassuming, yet it captured everyone's attention nonetheless. She paused at the threshold, her backpack casually slung over one shoulder, dark curls neatly tied back in a ponytail. Her caramel-toned skin shimmered under the bright fluorescent lights, and her eyes swiftly took in the room, meeting the unfamiliar stares of her new classmates. Whispers began almost instantly. "Who's that? Is she new here? Where did she transfer from?" The whispering intensified as Aaliyah fully stepped into the room, her movements soft but purposeful. Mrs. Thompson's keen eyes immediately fixed on her, a tight, thin smile curling her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and she slightly tilted her chin as if gearing up for a confrontation. "Well, well," Mrs. Thompson's voice pierced through the murmurs, silencing them instantly. "It appears we have a new member in our class today." Her tone dripped with insincere warmth, sending shivers down Aaliyah's spine. The students shifted in their seats, their gazes oscillating between Aaliyah and the teacher, eager to see how this interaction would unfold. Aaliyah stood confidently, resisting the urge to fidget under Mrs. Thompson's icy scrutiny. Her heart raced, but her expression remained composed. She had learned early that showing vulnerability in such situations only provided others with more leverage. And Mrs. Thompson, with her piercing eyes and strained smile, seemed like someone who thrived on that leverage. "I hope," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice slicing through the silence, "that you can keep up with our demanding curriculum." The term demanding lingered in the air, heavy with sarcasm. A brief pause followed, a tense moment stretching between them. It was evident from Mrs. Thompson's barely noticeable lip twitch that she had already judged Aaliyah, labeling her as yet another student unlikely to meet her extraordinarily high standards. But Aaliyah was no stranger to judgment. She had faced it before, both subtly and overtly. Raised eyebrows as she entered a room, quiet whispers assuming she wasn't paying attention, lowered expectations based on her skin color. She felt Mrs. Thompson's assumptions weighing down on her, but she had long since learned to stand strong beneath them. "I'll do my best," Aaliyah responded softly, her voice carrying strength. She met Mrs. Thompson's gaze, refusing to avert her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, something like surprise flickered in the teacher's eyes before it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Good," Mrs. Thompson replied, her forced smile still in place. "You may take your seat." The room's tension thickened as Aaliyah walked to an empty desk at the back. All eyes followed her, tracking her every move. She felt the curiosity burning against her back, but she maintained her composure, her steps steady. She had grown accustomed to being the new girl, standing out among familiar faces. It no longer fazed her. As she settled into her seat, the whispers resumed, low and cautious, like the beginnings of a brewing storm. Aaliyah didn't need to hear the words to understand their meaning. She had heard it all before. Where do you think she's from? Do you think she'll survive in this class? I bet Mrs. Thompson will break her down. Mrs. Thompson turned to the whiteboard, the squeak of her marker breaking the silence. Now, she stated, regaining her usual brisk no-nonsense tone, let's begin. Aaliyah opened her notebook, her eyes scanning the room as she listened to Mrs. Thompson start the day's lesson. The teacher's voice faded into the background as Aaliyah's thoughts drifted, her heart still pounding a bit too fast. She had dealt with teachers like Mrs. Thompson before, teachers who underestimated her, saw her skin color before her intellect, and assumed she couldn't keep up. But this time felt different. This wasn't just another classroom or another school. Something about Mrs. Thompson's gaze, the way her voice dripped with fake sweetness, told Aaliyah that this would be a battle unlike any she had faced before. And she wasn't sure who would come out on top. As the class continued, the air in room 306 remained thick with unspoken tension. Aaliyah kept her head down, taking notes, but her mind was racing. This wasn't going to be an ordinary day. And something told her that this wasn't going to be an ordinary school year either. The soft murmur of students flipping through pages and scribbling notes filled the room as Mrs. Thompson stood rigid at the front. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting a sterile glow over the rows of desks. Behind Mrs. Thompson, the whiteboard was blank except for 3 words in her angular handwriting. To kill a mockingbird. Today, Mrs. Thompson began, her voice sharp and authoritative, we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in this great American novel. Her words were crisp and calculated, as if she had rehearsed them countless times. She paced slowly in front of the board, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, a steady, rhythmic reminder of her dominance in the room. Aaliyah sat at the back, her pencil poised over her notebook. Her mind buzzed with thoughts. She had read To Kill a Mockingbird several times, each reading revealing new layers and insights. The themes of racism and moral courage weren't just abstract ideas to her, they were real lived experiences. Mrs. Thompson's voice droned on, but Aaliyah's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the book's deeper message. To her, the story wasn't just about Tom Robinson's trial, it was about the bystanders, the ways society allows injustice to fester. Power and oppression, Mrs. Thompson repeated, glancing around the room. What does the book teach us about these themes? Can anyone share their thoughts? Aaliyah's hand shot up almost instinctively. She had been waiting for this moment, eager to contribute and share her perspective. She felt a spark of excitement, certain she had something valuable to add to the discussion. But Mrs. Thompson's gaze passed right over her, as if Aaliyah's hand was invisible. Instead, she pointed to the front row. Michael, she called out, her tone softening slightly. What do you think? Michael cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, looking down at his notes. I think the book is about how people in power can, control others who are less powerful, he mumbled. His voice was flat, his response rehearsed and lacking conviction, but Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good, she said, her voice clipped. Yes, exactly. Power dynamics play a significant role in the novel. Anyone else? Aaliyah kept her hand raised, her heart sinking as Mrs. Thompson called on another student. This time it was Laura, a soft-spoken girl who recited something from the textbook verbatim. Mrs. Thompson responded with another curt nod, her expression unchanged. The responses were shallow, surface-level observations that barely scratched the surface of the text. Aaliyah's frustration began to simmer, but she maintained her composure, determined to wait her turn. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Thompson's eyes finally landed on Aaliyah. The teacher's smile was tight, her body language tense, as if acknowledging Aaliyah's presence was an obligation she couldn't avoid. "Yes, Ms. Williams," she said, her voice sharper than before. "Do you have something to add?" Aaliyah straightened in her seat, feeling her classmates' eyes on her, some curious, others indifferent. The weight of their gazes pressed down on her, but she pushed it aside. She had thought deeply about this and was ready to share. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism is deeply embedded in—" Before Aaliyah could finish, Mrs. Thompson's hand shot up, silencing her. The teacher's smile vanished, replaced with impatience. "Systemic racism?" she echoed, her voice laced with mockery. "This is a classic American novel, Ms. Williams, not some modern political commentary." The words landed with a dull thud, their impact rippling through the room. A ripple of unease passed as several students shifted in their seats. Some glanced at Aaliyah with wide eyes, while others looked down, pretending not to notice the growing tension. Aaliyah's pulse quickened. Heat rose to her cheeks, and her chest tightened. She felt the stares and judgment, but wasn't about to back down. She had faced this before, the dismissive tone, the subtle undermining of her intelligence. But she wouldn't let herself be silenced, not this time. "With all due respect, Mrs. Thompson," Aaliyah began again, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. "The book clearly addresses racial injustice through the trial of Tom Robinson. It's a reflection of—" "Enough," Mrs. Thompson snapped, turning her back on Aaliyah as she moved toward the whiteboard. "Focus on the text as it is, Miss Williams, not how you wish it to be. We're here to analyze the author's intentions, not to impose our own modern interpretations." The classroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. Aaliyah's hands clenched into fists beneath the desk, her nails digging into her palms. She felt her classmates' eyes burning into her skin, but none spoke. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Some students exchanged awkward glances, while others sat rigidly, eyes fixed on their desks. A few, those who had smirked at Mrs. Thompson's earlier remarks, seemed to relish the teacher's condescension, quietly amused by Aaliyah's isolation. Aaliyah struggled to keep her breathing steady, refusing to let frustration show. She had come to this classroom to learn, not to be silenced. But how could she learn when the person meant to educate her had already dismissed her voice? She glanced around, searching for a flicker of solidarity, someone willing to meet her eyes. But most students avoided her gaze, lost in their own thoughts. A few, like Sarah in the front row, gave her a small, apologetic glance, but it wasn't enough. The message was clear: Aaliyah was alone. Mrs. Thompson continued the lesson as if nothing had happened, scribbling a few words on the board in quick, precise strokes. "Now, let's discuss the symbolism of the mockingbird. Who can explain what it represents?" Aaliyah's fists relaxed, her fingers now cold against the smooth desk surface. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus, to not let Mrs. Thompson's dismissal rattle her. But the teacher's words echoed in her mind. "Focus on the text as it is, not how you wish it to be." What did that even mean? Was Mrs. Thompson implying that Aaliyah's understanding of the novel, its deep racial wounds, was irrelevant? Was she saying those themes didn't matter anymore, that they were relics of the past? Aaliyah's mind swirled with anger and confusion, but above all, she felt a deep, gnawing sense of injustice. She looked down at her notebook, her carefully written notes suddenly feeling insignificant. Her thoughts raced too fast to concentrate. Mrs. Thompson's words stung in a way Aaliyah hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about being ignored in a classroom discussion. It was about being told, yet again, that her experiences and insights didn't belong. But she couldn't give in to that. She wouldn't. As the class continued, Aaliyah quietly raised her hand again. Her voice wouldn't be silenced, not today. But Mrs. Thompson never looked her way. Days at Brierwood High began to blend together, each feeling like a slow march through an endless battleground. For Aaliyah, every moment in room 306 was a silent war, one she hadn't chosen but was determined to endure. Mrs. Thompson's icy demeanor and cutting remarks had become a constant, a relentless force pressing down on her day after day. The rest of the class had grown accustomed to the quiet conflict between their teacher and the new girl. It was as if an unspoken agreement had settled: don't get involved, don't take sides. Some watched with quiet sympathy, others with growing indifference, but no one dared to speak up. The classroom's atmosphere was thick, the tension only intensifying with each passing day. Aaliyah kept her head down, focusing on her notes, trying to avoid drawing Mrs. Thompson's attention. But no matter how hard she tried to blend into the background, the teacher's sharp gaze always seemed to find her. Every time Aaliyah raised her hand, Mrs. Thompson would look past her, calling on someone else with a dismissive flick of her eyes. When Aaliyah did manage to speak, Mrs. Thompson would cut her off mid-sentence, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. It was as if Aaliyah's thoughts and words didn't matter, like she didn't belong in that room. But Aaliyah refused to crumble under Mrs. Thompson's disdain. She kept attending class, kept raising her hand, kept speaking up, even when her voice was ignored, even when it felt like the entire room was closing in on her. Her silent resistance was her way of fighting back, even if no one else noticed. One afternoon, the classroom buzzed with the low hum of students working on their essays. The clicking of pens, the rustling of paper, the occasional cough or whispered conversation filled the room. Mrs. Thompson prowled the aisles, her eyes scanning the rows of students with hawk-like precision. Aaliyah sat near the back, her head bent over her notebook, her pen moving steadily as she jotted down her thoughts. The lesson that day had been on character development, and Aaliyah had immersed herself in her analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird. Her notes were meticulous, her thoughts clear, but she knew it didn't matter. No matter how hard she worked, Mrs. Thompson had already formed her opinion of her. A sudden voice pierced the quiet, harsh, and accusatory. "Ms. Williams." Aaliyah's head snapped up, her pen freezing mid-sentence. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the room, her eyes locked on Aaliyah with cold precision. "Are you chewing gum?" The question hung in the air like a slap, drawing the entire class's attention. Heads turned toward Aaliyah, eyes wide with curiosity and anticipation. Aaliyah blinked, momentarily thrown off. "No, ma'am," she replied, her voice steady but confused. She hadn't been chewing anything. Her lips were dry, her mouth empty. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a thin, disbelieving line. "Don't lie to me, young lady," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I can see you chewing from all the way up here. Spit it out." The room fell into a deathly silence. A few students exchanged glances, their faces a mix of amusement and discomfort. Some sat rigidly, not daring to move, while others watched with morbid fascination, eager to see what would happen next. The tension was thick, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Aaliyah felt the heat rise in her chest but forced herself to stay calm. She had learned long ago that reacting, giving in to anger or frustration, would only make things worse. Instead, she stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled, and walked toward the trash can at the front of the room. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, each step a reminder that she was alone in this battle. Reaching the trash can, she mimed spitting out the imaginary gum, her hand brushing her lips in a motion that felt both absurd and humiliating. The class watched in stunned silence, some smirking behind their hands, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Aaliyah's face burned, not from shame but from the injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, performing a pointless act just to satisfy Mrs. Thompson's need for control. It wasn't about the gum. It was never about the gum. It was about power. Mrs. Thompson wanted to remind her once again who held authority in this room. As Aaliyah returned to her seat, she caught a glimpse of Sarah in the front row. The quiet girl's eyes were filled with something like sympathy, a fleeting acknowledgement of the unfairness that had just occurred. But Sarah said nothing, her gaze quickly dropping to the desk in front of her. No one spoke. Aaliyah returned to her seat, her fists clenched tightly beneath the desk. She could sense her classmates' eyes fixed on her, the burden of their silent approval pressing down like a tangible force. Yet she refused to let it overwhelm her. Instead, she picked up her pen and resumed writing, her fingers gripping it so firmly her knuckles turned white. Minutes passed, and the room's usual quiet murmur gradually settled back into its typical low hum. Mrs. Thompson had shifted her focus to another student, but the weight of that moment lingered, dense and oppressive. Aaliyah's mind was a whirlwind of frustration, anger, and something deeper, something that teetered dangerously close to surrender. However, she couldn't succumb to that feeling. Not in this moment. She forced herself to concentrate on her notes, on the task before her. Her pen danced across the page, but her thoughts replayed the incident repeatedly in her mind. How many more times would she face this? How many more minor humiliations would she have to bear before things changed? A fleeting thought crossed her mind. What if I just stopped trying? Or what if I gave up? But she quickly dismissed it. Giving up wasn't an option. She had to persevere, to continue fighting, even if it felt like she was alone in this struggle. As the bell rang, marking the end of class, Aaliyah slowly packed her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She refused to show Mrs. Thompson any sign of weakness, any hint that her words and actions had shaken her. She would keep attending, keep raising her hand, keep voicing her thoughts, even if no one paid attention. Upon leaving the classroom, Aaliyah felt the weight of Sarah's glance, a silent apology reflected in her slightly slumped shoulders. Yet once again no words were exchanged. The conflict between Aaliyah and Mrs. Thompson wasn't loud or overt. It was quiet, subtle, an invisible battle fought through stolen glances, interrupted sentences, and small, biting moments of embarrassment. But Aaliyah was certain of one thing: she wouldn't stop fighting. Not yet. The awaited day had finally arrived, the day Aaliyah had both dreaded and meticulously prepared for. Group project presentations had been looming over her for weeks, a dark cloud on the horizon. She knew from the beginning that this was the moment Mrs. Thompson had been waiting for, a chance to dismantle her, to humiliate her in front of the entire class. Aaliyah could feel it in her bones. Seated at her desk, Aaliyah reviewed her notes one last time. She had worked tirelessly on her presentation, diving into books, research papers, and scholarly articles late into the night. Her project focused on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage in To Kill a Mockingbird, a topic she chose not only because it resonated with her personally, but also because it was central to the novel's essence. She ensured every point was supported by evidence, every argument grounded in textual analysis. She was ready, or as ready as she could be. But now, none of that seemed to matter. As Mrs. Thompson called her name, Aaliyah stood, the eyes of her classmates following her every move. The tension in the room was thick, heavy, as if everyone anticipated the inevitable clash. Her legs felt shaky, but she forced herself to walk steadily to the front, her notes clutched tightly in her hand. Mrs. Thompson stood at the side of the classroom, arms crossed, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She resembled a predator watching its prey, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Taking a deep breath, Aaliyah began her presentation, her voice calm yet strong. To Kill a Mockingbird, she started, is a novel that delves into the deeply ingrained racial injustice in the American South during the 1930s. Through Tom Robinson's trial, Harper Lee examines how systemic racism impacts not only individuals but entire communities. Her words were clear and well organized, but as she spoke she felt Mrs. Thompson's gaze intensify, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Aaliyah pressed on, determined to complete her presentation without faltering. She discussed the moral courage of characters like Atticus Finch, the symbolism of the mockingbird representing innocence destroyed by prejudice, and how Tom Robinson's trial exposed the harsh realities of racial inequality. As Aaliyah continued, she noticed Mrs. Thompson's smile tighten, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was a subtle shift, but Aaliyah could feel its weight. She had seen this look before, the look of someone poised to pounce at the right moment. Midway through the presentation, Mrs. Thompson raised her hand. Aaliyah froze for a split second, her heart skipping a beat. The room, which had been quiet until then, seemed to hold its breath. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson?" Aaliyah asked, striving to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Thompson's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the smile of someone who had eagerly awaited this moment. "Miss Williams," she began sweetly, her tone dripping with false politeness, "don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel? Shouldn't you concentrate on the broader literary merits instead of fixating on racial themes?" Her words were like a knife, sharp and precise. A ripple of unease spread through the classroom. A few students exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Aaliyah and Mrs. Thompson. Others remained still, unsure of how to react. The air was thick with tension, pressing down from all sides. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she stayed composed. This was exactly what she had anticipated. She knew Mrs. Thompson would attempt to discredit her, to undermine her argument before the entire class. But anticipating it didn't make it any easier. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Aaliyah responded, "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the novel, Mrs. Thompson. Harper Lee intended the trial of Tom Robinson to highlight the deep-rooted racial inequalities." Mrs. Thompson cut her off, her smile fading as her eyes hardened. "Perhaps," she interrupted sharply, "you should dedicate less time to personal agendas and more to critical analysis. This novel is about far more than just race." Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the sting of Mrs. Thompson's words like a slap across her face. A gasp rippled through the room as students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The ensuing silence was suffocating, as if the entire class awaited Aaliyah's next move. Her fists clenched beneath the desk, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to suppress the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She refused to let tears fall. Not here, not in front of Mrs. Thompson, not in front of the class. She knew this wasn't merely about the book. It wasn't just about To Kill a Mockingbird. It was about something much deeper, about power, about who controlled the narrative, about whose voice was deemed valid and whose wasn't. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in her mind, personal agendas, critical analysis, overemphasizing. What Mrs. Thompson was truly conveying was that Aaliyah's perspective didn't matter, that her lived experiences and insights were somehow less valid because they focused on race, that her voice was too loud, too insistent, too inconvenient. Aaliyah took a slow, deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She wouldn't give Mrs. Thompson the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Not today." "I respectfully disagree," Aaliyah said, her voice quieter yet steady. "The racial themes are integral to the story, and ignoring them would be ignoring the very heart of the novel." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The smile was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. She was losing control of the situation, and Aaliyah could see it. The teacher's next words were clipped and sharp as knives. "Miss Williams," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice rising slightly, "perhaps you should take a moment to reflect on whether you truly understand the broader context of this novel. This class values academic rigor, and I'm afraid your analysis seems limited." The room fell silent once more. Some students stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Others glanced nervously at Aaliyah, unsure of how to respond. It was clear now that this wasn't just about academic criticism, it was personal, a power play. Aaliyah swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between two choices: stand her ground or let the weight of Mrs. Thompson's authority push her over. But deep down, Aaliyah knew she couldn't back down. Not now. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let this moment break her. With a calm she didn't entirely feel, Aaliyah met Mrs. Thompson's gaze. "I'll continue to refine my analysis, Mrs. Thompson. But I stand by my interpretation. To Kill a Mockingbird is, at its core, a story about race, and I believe it's important to acknowledge that." Mrs. Thompson's jaw tightened, her frustration evident. For a brief moment, the two stood locked in a silent standoff, the tension between them thick and electric. It was a battle of wills, a clash between authority and resistance, and the entire class could feel it. Finally, Mrs. Thompson let out a small, tight laugh. "Very well, Ms. Williams," she said coldly. "You may continue." But the damage had already been done. As Aaliyah turned back to her notes, her heart still racing, she knew this was far from over. Mrs. Thompson had made it clear. This was a fight for control, and she wasn't going to let Aaliyah win easily. As Aaliyah continued her presentation, her voice steady but her heart heavy, she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. She was fighting a battle much bigger than herself, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold her ground. The room remained thick with tension, every eye glued to Aaliyah as she stood at the front. Her presentation had ended, but the battle between her and Mrs. Thompson was far from over. The air was heavy with the unsaid and the unspoken. Aaliyah could still feel the sting of Mrs. Thompson's thinly veiled insults, her dismissal of Aaliyah's hard work and intellect. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the classroom door creaked open. Heads turned as the door swung wide, and in walked a tall, imposing figure. Mr. Williams, the school principal, entered the room with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. His tailored suit, crisp and dark, spoke of professionalism and power, and the steady sound of his polished shoes echoed in the sudden silence. A ripple of recognition passed through the students. Some sat up straighter in their seats, while others exchanged curious glances, unsure why the principal had arrived unannounced. But Mrs. Thompson's reaction was different. A smug, self-satisfied smile spread across her face, and she straightened her posture, clearly assuming that Mr. Williams had come to validate her authority. "Ah, Mr. Williams," Mrs. Thompson greeted him, her tone filled with the kind of forced warmth reserved for those in positions of power. She remained standing at the side of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "We were just wrapping up some presentations, and I've actually been meaning to talk to you about Ms. Williams here." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. She glanced at her father, her heart hammering in her chest, but Mr. Williams gave nothing away. His expression remained neutral, his dark eyes sweeping over the classroom before landing on Mrs. Thompson. Aaliyah's classmates watched with rapt attention, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Oblivious to the connection between Aaliyah and the principal, Mrs. Thompson continued her thinly veiled critique, her voice laced with condescension. "You see," she said, gesturing toward Aaliyah, "Miss Williams has been, well, let's just say she's been a bit of a challenge." Aaliyah felt her face flush, the weight of her classmates' stares pressing down on her. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear under their watchful eyes. But Mr. Williams remained composed, his expression carefully measured. "And what seems to be the problem, Mrs. Thompson?" Mr. Williams asked, his voice calm yet carrying an undercurrent of authority. "Well, Mrs. Thompson began, clearly pleased to have an audience for her grievances. "Miss Williams seems to have difficulty separating her personal feelings from academic analysis. She's overly focused on certain themes that, while important, are not the sole focus of the literature we're studying. I've tried to guide her toward a more balanced approach, but she continues to fixate on, let's call them modern political interpretations." She paused, glancing at Mr. Williams to gauge his reaction. When he gave none, she pressed on, emboldened. "I've spoken to her multiple times, but she seems intent on pushing her own personal agenda. I believe a meeting with her parents is in order. We wouldn't want her to fall behind." Aaliyah clenched her fists beneath the desk, her jaw tight as she fought back the sting of frustration. She had expected Mrs. Thompson to criticize her, but hearing it laid out in front of the principal and her classmates felt like a public condemnation. She could feel the weight of her classmates' judgment, some watching with wide eyes, others smirking as they sensed the drama unfolding. The room held its collective breath. "I see," Mr. Williams said slowly, his voice measured. His face remained impassive, but there was a storm brewing behind his eyes, a storm only Aaliyah recognized. "And you think Ms. Williams's focus on these themes is inappropriate?" "I wouldn't say inappropriate," Mrs. Thompson replied, her smile widening slightly. But it's certainly misguided. Her emphasis on racial themes in To Kill a Mockingbird is overshadowing her ability to engage with the broader literary merits of the novel. I'm afraid her work has become one-dimensional, and it's starting to disrupt the learning environment. I think it's best to involve her parents before this becomes a larger issue. Mr. Williams raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, but his tone remained calm. I see. And you believe Ms. Williams is struggling because of her inability to focus on what you consider to be the broader literary themes. Exactly, Mrs. Thompson said, folding her arms. She seems unable to see the novel from a more objective point of view. There was a pause, a pregnant silence filling the room as Mr. Williams studied Mrs. Thompson, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his next words carefully. The students watched, wide-eyed, sensing something significant was about to happen, but unsure of what it was. Finally, with quiet authority, Mr. Williams spoke. I am Aaliyah's father. The bombshell landed and the ensuing silence was deafening. For a split second, Mrs. Thompson's expression froze, her smile faltering as the words sank in. Her eyes widened, and a flicker of realization washed over her face. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly, as if she couldn't quite process what she had just heard. The class remained still, every student holding their breath, their eyes darting between Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Williams. The room felt suspended in time, the weight of the moment crashing down like a tidal wave. I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Thompson stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Williams' expression didn't change. He remained calm, his voice steady. "Aaliyah is my daughter," he repeated, this time with a firmer tone. "And I've been listening very carefully to everything you've said about her." The color drained from Mrs. Thompson's face. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation vanished, replaced by a growing sense of horror. I had no idea." Mrs. Thompson finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling. "I didn't realize." "Clearly," Mr. Williams replied, his voice as cool as ever. But there was an edge to it now, a quiet fury simmering just beneath the surface. "But whether you knew or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is the way you've treated my daughter in your classroom, the way you've dismissed her perspective, and the way you've made assumptions about her academic abilities based on your own biases." Mrs. Thompson's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her desk for support. I wasn't aware. I didn't mean—" Mr. Williams cut her off, his eyes flashing with steely determination. "Ignorance is no excuse, Mrs. Thompson. The fact that you felt comfortable speaking to me about my daughter in such a manner, without even realizing who she was, tells me everything I need to know." The tension in the room was suffocating. Some students stared down at their desks, afraid to meet anyone's eyes. Others watched with a kind of morbid fascination, unable to tear their gaze away from the unfolding drama. Mrs. Thompson looked around the room, as though searching for an escape, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in around her, her carefully constructed world crumbling at her feet. Mr. Williams took a step closer, his voice low but commanding. "You've not only underestimated my daughter, but you've dismissed her perspective as misguided, simply because it challenges your own narrow view of the text. I would expect more from an educator." I didn't mean," Mrs. Thompson stammered, her voice growing weaker. "I only wanted to." "I think you've said enough, Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Williams said firmly. "We'll be discussing this matter further." The room was utterly silent as Mrs. Thompson stood there, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with shock. She seemed frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of her own actions. "Now," Mr. Williams said, turning to the class, his voice calm yet authoritative, "please continue with your assigned work. I'll be taking Mrs. Thompson out of the classroom for a moment." As Mr. Williams led a visibly shaken Mrs. Thompson out of the room, the door closed behind them with a soft click. A hushed murmur spread through the class. Whispers and wide-eyed looks exchanged among the students. Aaliyah sat quietly, her heart still racing, but a small sense of vindication settled over her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen, the color draining from her face like ink washed from a canvas. The confidence she had wielded so effortlessly throughout the school year evaporated in an instant, leaving her standing there, exposed and vulnerable. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. She was grasping for words that simply wouldn't come. Mr. Williams stood completely still, his outward composure concealing the turmoil that raged within him. His gaze was locked onto Mrs. Thompson, his authoritative presence bearing down on her like an overwhelming weight. The room was thick with silence, each student leaning forward in their seats, holding their breath, anticipating what would happen next. I can explain," Mrs. Thompson finally managed, her voice trembling and barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I'm not interested in excuses," Mr. Williams cut in, his tone calm yet exuding undeniable authority. "Your treatment of my daughter and the underlying prejudice you've exhibited in this classroom will not go unaddressed." His words sliced through the room sharply and precisely. A collective gasp spread among the students, their wide eyes shifting between Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Williams. They had never witnessed a teacher, especially one as formidable and respected as Mrs. Thompson, being directly challenged, and certainly not by the principal. It was an unforeseen scene that left them paralyzed, uncertain of how to respond. Aaliyah straightened in her seat, her heart racing. The vindication she had long desired, the justice she had quietly hoped for, was unfolding right before her eyes. She felt the tension ease from her shoulders, the burden of weeks of silent resistance lifting just a bit. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she wasn't fighting this struggle alone. Mrs. Thompson's hands shook slightly as she held onto the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. She blinked rapidly, her thoughts racing as she sought a way to regain control of the situation. But escaping the reality of what had transpired was impossible. She couldn't talk her way out of this. The meticulously maintained facade of authority she had worn for so long was beginning to crumble, and everyone in the room noticed. "Mr. Williams," she attempted once more, her voice wavering. "I never intended to. Intention doesn't matter," Mr. Williams interrupted again, his voice steady but firm. "What matters is the effect of your actions. You've consistently dismissed and undermined my daughter's perspective based on your own biases. That is unacceptable." The room fell deathly silent, every word from Mr. Williams landing with the force of a hammer strike. No one moved or whispered. Even the usual sounds of papers shuffling and feet fidgeting had ceased. It was as though time itself had halted to witness justice finally taking its course. Mrs. Thompson shifted uneasily, her previously unyielding grip on the class slipping away like sand through her fingers. She had long commanded respect and controlled every detail of her classroom, but now she found herself on the defensive in a way she had never experienced before. "We can discuss this further," she stammered, her voice cracking as she gestured weakly toward the door. "Perhaps in private." Mr. Williams nodded, his expression impassive. "Yes, we will discuss this privately," he affirmed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But understand this, Mrs. Thompson. This isn't solely about today's incident. It concerns a pattern of behavior that has no place in our school." Mrs. Thompson swallowed hard, her eyes nervously darting toward the door. "Of course," she replied quickly, her voice shaky. "I understand." With a stiff nod, Mrs. Thompson led the way to the door, her shoulders slightly hunched as if burdened by her own mistakes. Mr. Williams followed, his posture straight and commanding, his presence dominating the room even as he moved toward the exit. Upon reaching the door, Mr. Williams paused and turned back to address the class. His gaze softened just a fraction as he looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting Aaliyah's in a silent acknowledgement. "Students," he began, his voice calm yet authoritative, "please continue with your assigned reading. We will resume normal class activities shortly." There was a brief moment of stillness, followed by a soft shuffle as students opened their books. The tension in the air began to lessen, though only slightly. Whispers floated through the room like smoke, low and tentative, as students exchanged glances filled with curiosity and disbelief. The classroom buzzed with a newfound energy, one that had been absent for weeks, the energy of a system being disrupted, of authority being challenged. Aaliyah remained quiet, her mind racing even as her body stayed still. Relief washed over her, mixed with something deeper, something unexpected. The vindication she felt wasn't as straightforward as she had imagined. It wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson being confronted or her father's authoritative intervention. It was about something more significant, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. For the first time, the power dynamics in the room had shifted, and Aaliyah was no longer on the losing end. Her classmates seemed to sense the change as well. They whispered among themselves, casting curious glances Aaliyah's way. Some appeared uncomfortable, others intrigued, but none could deny that something important had just occurred. It was as if the veil had been lifted, and the subtle injustices that had been brewing were now exposed for everyone to see. Sarah, the usually quiet girl who often sat at the front of the room, met Aaliyah's gaze. For weeks, Sarah had been one of the few students who offered Aaliyah sympathetic looks and small gestures of understanding that hadn't gone unnoticed. Now, Sarah's expression held a cautious hope, as though she was also waiting to see what would unfold next. She gave Aaliyah a small, tentative smile, and Aaliyah felt a flicker of gratitude. As the door closed softly behind Mr. Williams and Mrs. Thompson, the room's tension began to ease. Though the atmosphere had undeniably changed, the whispers grew louder, more confident now that the authority figures had left. "I can't believe that just happened," one student murmured. "Did you see Mrs. Thompson's face?" another whispered, eyes wide in disbelief. "She's in so much trouble." Aaliyah overheard the comments but remained silent, processing the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She felt validated, yes, but also exhausted. The fight had drained her more than she had realized, and now that it was over, at least for the time being, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Her mind replayed the events of the past weeks, the silent battles, the small acts of resistance she had clung to when it seemed like she had no other choice. But in this moment she realized it had all been worthwhile. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be silenced. A small smile tugged at her lips. Justice, it seemed, had finally caught up to Mrs. Thompson. And Aaliyah had witnessed it. The office door clicked shut with a quiet finality, the soft sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. Mrs. Thompson sat rigidly in her chair, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her back uncomfortably pressed against the stiff leather. Across from her sat Mr. Williams, the principal, his posture calm yet authoritative, a quiet storm brewing behind his steady gaze. Mr. Williams's office walls were lined with neatly organized bookshelves and plaques of recognition, each one showcasing his decades of dedication to the education system. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension between the two palpable. Mrs. Thompson had handled difficult conversations before. As a seasoned teacher with decades of experience, she had dealt with complaints, managed upset parents, and navigated various disciplinary meetings. But this situation was different. There was no avoiding the issue, no softening the impact of what had transpired in her classroom that day. This time, the truth was exposed, and there was no escaping the repercussions. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice unnaturally soft, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, "I want to assure you that none of my actions were intentional. I never meant to make Aaliyah, your daughter, feel excluded." Her words lingered in the air, feeble and insubstantial, as if even she didn't believe them. Mrs. Thompson had rehearsed these lines in her mind since the confrontation in her classroom, but now, face to face with the principal, they felt empty, devoid of the conviction she had hoped to convey. Mr. Williams remained silent, his eyes fixed on her, waiting. The silence stretched on seemingly forever before he finally spoke, his voice calm yet unyielding. "This isn't just about intention, Mrs. Thompson," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about the impact of your actions. The pattern of behavior you've shown in my daughter's classroom, and likely in others, is a clear sign of a deeper issue. You've undermined her voice, dismissed her perspective, and made assumptions about her abilities and character based on your own biases. This is not acceptable." Mrs. Thompson blinked, her face paling. She had expected Mr. Williams to be firm, but not this direct. Her heart pounded in her chest, a dull thud echoing in her ears. "I understand how it may have come across, but I assure you—" "You're missing the point," Mr. Williams interrupted, his tone remaining calm but growing more intense. "This isn't just about how it appeared. It's about what it reveals about you and the environment you've created in that classroom." He stood up, moving to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over the school grounds. The setting sun cast long shadows across the campus, students moving about, oblivious to the storm brewing in the principal's office. Mrs. Thompson watched him nervously, her fingers twisting together in her lap. She felt small, shrinking under the weight of his words. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in control of the conversation. She wasn't the one setting the terms. Mr. Williams turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "Do you know what it feels like," he asked slowly, "to walk into your own daughter's classroom and see her being dismissed? Diminished by someone who should be nurturing her potential? To hear a teacher, someone I trusted with her education, reduce her contributions to personal agendas and fixations on racial themes, as though those aren't integral parts of her lived experience." Mrs. Thompson swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? What excuse could possibly make this right? "And this isn't just about Aaliyah," Mr. Williams continued, his voice steady yet unyielding. "I'm willing to bet she's not the only student of color you've treated this way." The accusation struck Mrs. Thompson like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself, but Mr. Williams wasn't finished. "How many other students have you dismissed in the same way?" he pressed. "How many other voices have you silenced, either because their perspectives didn't align with yours, or because you didn't see value in their lived experiences?" Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. In her mind, she began to replay moments from her years of teaching, instances when she had brushed off a student's comments, redirected uncomfortable discussions, or shut down viewpoints she hadn't wanted to engage with. Had she done this to others? Had she dismissed students like Aaliyah simply because their experiences didn't fit into her narrow definition of academic rigor? Mr. Williams's eyes softened slightly. "I've spent my entire career striving to create an environment where all students, regardless of their background, can feel seen, heard, and valued. And yet, in my own school, under my watch, my own daughter felt silenced. Can you imagine how that feels?" Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled in her lap. Mr. Williams, I never—" "This isn't about what you intended," he said firmly, cutting her off once more. "It's about the impact. It's about the fact that, whether you meant to or not, you've created an environment where certain students feel less valued, less heard, simply because their perspectives make you uncomfortable." The ensuing silence was heavy and oppressive. Mrs. Thompson could feel her career slipping away, her decades of experience and reputation crumbling in the face of her mistakes. Mr. Williams took a deep breath, his tone softening, yet his words remaining impactful. "I take no pleasure in this, Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly. "But there are consequences for this kind of behavior, consequences that cannot be ignored." Tears welled in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. She had prided herself on being a strong, respected teacher, someone admired by colleagues and students alike. And yet here she was, sitting before the principal, being confronted for the very thing she had always claimed to oppose: prejudice. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Mr. Williams nodded, his expression remaining resolute. "I believe you're sorry," he said softly. "But sorry doesn't change the fact that you've caused harm. The harm has been done, and it's not something that can be undone with an apology." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. Mrs. Thompson sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, her mind reeling. "The school board will be notified," Mr. Williams continued. "A formal investigation will be conducted, and based on the severity of the situation, I can't see any outcome other than your immediate resignation. Brierwood High cannot and will not tolerate this kind of behavior." Mrs. Thompson's breath caught, her hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Resignation?" she echoed, her voice cracking. Mr. Williams nodded. "Yes, I believe that's the only way forward." For a moment the room remained still, the gravity of the situation hanging between them like a heavy weight. Mrs. Thompson's career, her identity, everything she had built over the years, was unraveling beneath her. She could feel tears forming in her eyes again, but this time she didn't bother to blink them away. She had lost. She knew it. And there was no escaping the consequences now. By the end of the meeting, Mrs. Thompson's tenure at Brierwood High had come to an end. As she stood to leave, she felt the weight of her mistakes bearing down on her with each step. The door to Mr. Williams' office closed behind her with a soft thud, and the realization struck her deeply. She had spent years silencing others. Now it was her own voice that had been silenced. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Brierwood High, casting gentle rays of light across the hallways. It was a new day, yet something felt different. The air was alive with renewed energy, as if the very walls of the school were pulsating with possibility. Aaliyah sensed it the moment she walked through the doors. The hushed whispers and sideways glances that had once followed her were gone, replaced by something warmer and more welcoming. As she made her way down the main corridor, Aaliyah noticed students, some who had barely acknowledged her before, now greeting her with smiles and waves. It was subtle at first, a nod here, a small smile there, but it was enough for her to realize that things had genuinely changed. The tension that had gripped the school for weeks was beginning to fade, leaving behind a sense of possibility and transformation. "Aaliyah!" a voice called out from behind her. She turned to see Sarah, the quiet girl who had always sat at the front of English class, hurrying toward her with a bright smile. Sarah had been one of the few who had shown Aaliyah small gestures of sympathy during the ordeal with Mrs. Thompson, but now her smile held something more, admiration. "Hey, Sarah," Aaliyah greeted, her voice calm yet warm. "I just wanted to say," Sarah began, slightly out of breath, "what happened in class the other day. It was incredible. I can't believe how strong you were. Standing up to Mrs. Thompson like that, it must have been so hard." Aaliyah blinked, surprised by the sudden compliment. She hadn't seen herself as particularly brave in those moments. She had simply done what felt right. But hearing it from Sarah made her realize that perhaps she had made a bigger impact than she had thought. "Thank you," Aaliyah responded, a small smile forming on her lips. It wasn't easy, but it had to be done. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "I know. And it's not just me. Everyone's talking about it. People are already signing up for the diversity workshop Mr. Williams mentioned. There's even talk of starting a cultural awareness club. It's amazing what's happening." Aaliyah felt a surge of pride and relief. The changes she had long hoped for were beginning to take root. It wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson leaving, it was about a shift in the school's culture, a recognition that more voices needed to be heard and valued. As they walked down the hallway together, Aaliyah noticed posters on the walls advertising the upcoming diversity workshop. The flyers, brightly colored and bold, announced a new initiative aimed at fostering inclusivity and cultural awareness at Brierwood. The workshops were part of a broader effort led by Mr. Williams to address the underlying issues that had surfaced during the confrontation with Mrs. Thompson. What was once ignored or dismissed was now at the forefront of conversations, and it felt as though the school was awakening to a new reality. Students gathered in small groups, discussing the changes with excitement. Words like cultural awareness and diversity floated through the air, once whispered, now spoken openly. The halls buzzed with a feeling that something important was underway. As they approached the English classroom, Sarah glanced at Aaliyah and asked, "Are you nervous about class today? I heard we have a substitute." Aaliyah shrugged, though truthfully, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. "Not really. I'm just glad things are different now." Upon entering the classroom, the difference was immediately apparent. The once tense atmosphere had shifted. The sense of foreboding that had overshadowed every lesson was replaced by openness and curiosity. The faces that turned to greet Aaliyah as she walked to her seat weren't filled with judgment or indifference. They were supportive and welcoming. A new teacher stood at the front of the room, a young woman with a kind smile and bright eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Johnson, the substitute who would be covering the class for the rest of the semester. Unlike Mrs. Thompson, whose presence had always been sharp and commanding, Mrs. Johnson exuded warmth, her voice inviting as she outlined the lesson plan for the day. Aaliyah settled into her seat, a sense of peace enveloping her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on her. She didn't have to brace herself for a dismissive remark or a cold glare. Instead, she could focus on the lesson, her thoughts, her learning. It felt like a breath of fresh air, a new beginning. The class passed swiftly, and as they delved into discussions of symbolism in literature, Aaliyah noticed something remarkable. Students were participating more freely, their voices confident and unafraid. There was no fear of being dismissed or ignored. Ideas flowed openly, and Mrs. Johnson encouraged every contribution, nodding thoughtfully and offering feedback that was supportive rather than critical. During a group activity, several students even approached Aaliyah to seek her insights on their analyses. The change was subtle yet significant. She was no longer merely the girl who stood up to Mrs. Thompson. She was now recognized as someone whose opinions were important, whose viewpoints were appreciated. By the end of the class, Aaliyah felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. As the bell rang and students began gathering their belongings, many paused to offer kind remarks, something that would have been unimaginable just days prior. "You did amazing last week, Aaliyah," one student remarked as they passed by. "Thanks for speaking up." Another classmate nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you handled that whole situation better than anyone else could have. Respect." Aaliyah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't accustomed to receiving this kind of attention or recognition, but she welcomed it. It wasn't about fame or popularity. It was about being genuinely seen for the first time. She had stood up not just for herself, but for something greater, and now the school was beginning to transform because of it. As the class emptied, Aaliyah lingered for a moment, her gaze fixed on the familiar walls of the English classroom. The memories of what had transpired here, the tension, the humiliation, the battles she had endured, felt distant now, like shadows fading with the dawn. She had weathered the storm, and now she could finally start to thrive. After school, as Aaliyah walked through the halls, she noticed more students engaging with her, talking excitedly about the upcoming changes. There were plans for a cultural awareness club, initiatives to diversify the curriculum, and the creation of a mentorship program for minority students. The energy in the school had shifted. What was once an undercurrent of discomfort was now a current of transformation, carrying the promise of something better. Stepping outside into the warm afternoon sun, Aaliyah took a deep breath, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The horizon stretched out before her, vast and open, filled with possibility. She wasn't just a student at Brierwood anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience, a testament that standing up for what's right can lead to genuine change. Her father's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. What happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up. And Aaliyah had done just that. She had spoken up. And now a new chapter at Brierwood High was beginning, one filled with hope, inclusivity, and the assurance that no voice would ever be silenced again. As she walked toward the gates, the sun setting behind her, Aaliyah knew the journey wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt prepared, ready to face whatever came next, knowing she had the strength to meet it head-on. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows over the school grounds as Aaliyah and her father exited the building, the air cool and crisp. The day had been filled with quiet victories, subtle moments of recognition, and the lingering warmth of newfound respect. But as Aaliyah walked beside Mr. Williams, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed, and how much more still needed to. The school felt different now, but the journey was far from complete. Mr. Williams glanced at his daughter, his expression softened with pride. He had always known Aaliyah possessed a quiet strength, but witnessing it unfold so powerfully filled him with awe. He gently squeezed her shoulder, his voice calm yet resolute. "What happened here wasn't just about one teacher or one classroom," he said. "You sparked something bigger." Aaliyah looked up at him, the weight of his words settling in. She had always hoped that standing up to Mrs. Thompson would make a difference. But she hadn't fully grasped the extent until now. The ripple effect of her courage had spread beyond Brierwood High, impacting students, teachers, and even parents who had silently wished for change. "I just hope it makes a difference," she replied softly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Not just for me, but for everyone." Her father nodded. "It already has." And he was right. Aaliyah could already see the changes taking root, not just within the school, but in the community as well. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening openly. Students who had previously been too afraid to speak up were finding their voices, inspired by Aaliyah's strength. Teachers who had ignored subtle biases in their classrooms were now reflecting on their actions, reconsidering their approach to education. It started small, with students at Brierwood High signing up for the diversity workshops Mr. Williams had introduced. What began as a school initiative quickly evolved into something larger, a movement spreading throughout the district. Other schools took notice of what had transpired at Brierwood and began implementing their own workshops on inclusivity, fostering open dialogues between students and teachers about race, culture, and identity. Aaliyah's name became synonymous with quiet strength and resilience. People began referring to her story as the spark that lit the fire, a testament that change often starts with a single act of courage. Beyond the school district, the ripple effect continued to spread. Community leaders took notice of the changes at Brierwood, and soon, local organizations reached out to the school to offer support. A community-wide initiative to promote inclusivity was launched, bringing together students, parents, teachers, and local leaders to address issues of racial and cultural disparity within the community. Aaliyah, though naturally shy, found herself at the heart of this movement. Her story was one of perseverance and quiet bravery in the face of injustice, resonating with people far beyond her school's walls. She had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of hope, a reminder that even the smallest voice can have a profound impact when it speaks the truth. One day, as Aaliyah sat with her father at the dinner table, reflecting on everything that had happened, Mr. Williams smiled at her, pride evident in his eyes. "You didn't just change Brierwood, Aaliyah. You changed the community. And who knows how far that change will go." Aaliyah looked at him, her heart full of gratitude. She hadn't set out to become a leader or a symbol of change. She had simply wanted to be heard, to be seen. But in doing so, she had ignited something much larger than herself. "It's not just me, Dad," she said softly. "It's all of us." And she was right. What had started as one voice had become many, and those voices had the power to change the world. What would you have done if you were in Aaliyah's shoes, or if you were her father discovering the truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more of these narratives. See you in the next video.